everybody.
Morning.
Welcome to Creating Effective Animal Characters. My name is Kevin Strauss, and in the next hour and a half, my goal for you, and ideally your goal for yourselves, is to find out ways to make more effective animal characters. And of course, then that begs the question, what does that mean? And so when I think about that, I think about effective animal characters kind of sound right in the way they talk and how they talk. They move right, whether you're using some physicality to let your character come through. They have a reason for their behavior. A lot of times in stories, animals might get good reasons for what they're doing, might not be real clear in the story, but effective characters have some kind of a reason for why they do what they do. And they also see the world through their own sets of eyes and ears. Because believe it or not, storytellers throughout history have not been naturalists. And so they've often used cultural stereotypes about animals. Bats being, what are bats like? Blind, yeah. Foxes being?
Sneaky.
Clever, tricky, yeah, exactly. Now there is a little bit of biology truth to some of these. Bats actually can see really well, but they fly in the dark where you can't use your eyes. But, and so when I began working as a storyteller, and also working as a naturalist, I realized the two worlds didn't really connect up. That I'd hear someone telling this beautiful story about a butterfly, and they talk about it going into its cocoon. And being a naturalist, I think, oh, they don't go to cocoons, they go to chrysalises, it's a whole different thing. And I thought, okay, with just one little switch, you could fix that whole thing, and you teach biology, and you have a great folktale. And so I set about a mission trying to help storytellers be better naturalists, and naturalists be better storytellers, because both groups can learn from each other. And that turned into some workshops and book projects and that sort of thing. But it usually doesn't take a lot. It takes a small amount. Our two big ideas for today are that knowing biology and ecology helps you be more effective in telling animal stories. And that's part of why it's so valuable to storytellers. Not that necessarily it's your job to teach about animals, but it makes for a better story. Just in the same way that if you're telling a story from Japan or India, knowing something about those cultures and what the architecture looked like and how people dressed in a certain time period makes you a better storyteller from different cultural stories. Knowing some biology makes you a better storyteller with animal stories, because it kind of gives you the culture and pieces that make sense for why those animals do what they do. Plus, on the other hand, it also gives you another little dimension to your story. The second big idea for today is that storytellers can either reinforce animal stereotypes or work against them. Because we all know sort of the cliches about animals. And being a naturalist, there are always some animals that usually got negative roles. If you were a meat eater, you were always the villain. If you were a mosquito, you were always the villain. If you were a snake, you were always the villain. I guess these were all meat eaters. And being a naturalist, I wanted to sort of work against those stereotypes. So I had to figure out, can I find stories that do that? And sometimes you can't. And then it's a matter of how do you make stories. And we're not going to get quite to the making stories end of it, but we'll talk about how you can take existing stories, folktales and even personal stories, and add more science into them so that they're make more sense for listeners and they're more interesting and teach a little bit of science, but also give some of these effective character traits to your storytelling as you're going. So now that you know a little bit about why I'm here and why I do this, let's see, 3, 6, 9. Great. We're going to be working in groups of 3-ish. So with some activities. You don't have to get into a group now, but at some point we're going to be doing that. But I'm curious from me, we don't have to go through everybody, but why are you guys here? What are some things you'd like to hear about in the next hour and a half? Or what things brought you to this workshop? If folks want to just shout them out, or...
I tell a lot of animal stories.
Okay.
And I can always learn something.
Good. What category? Like folktales or fables or what sort of
These
stories?
are stories I made up.
Okay.
A lot of farm animals, but not all farm animals.
Excellent. Okay.
And I don't know anything about them. So.
Okay. Yeah. This is great. Yeah.
I want to tell more animal stories because a lot of animal stories that I read and I had heard other people had this problem didn't sound like the animals.
Right.
And that exactly what you mentioned is I don't like the stories where the wolf is always the bad guy, so I'm hoping to get more interesting stories out of this.
Right. So, and we'll talk about research toward the end. Is where do you find those stories that you want? And sometimes you can't. And then you have to work on building, and we'll talk about some of those building blocks. Good. Other things folks would like to hear about or do in the next hour.
I'm a zoo person and I really struggle with anthropomorphism. So how can I tell a valid biology story through storytelling?
Mm-hmm. Right. Good point. That actually brings up a really good idea with the difference between science and storytelling. And I often talk about it. There's a great quote in a book, Sea of Cortez, and now I'm spacing on the author's name. John Steinbeck. Wrote a book, Sea of Cortez, when he was living in California, and he talked about real biologists and lab biologists. And he said, real biologists are the people out there in the ocean catching animals and looking at the fish in their nets and measuring them. And he said, you know, when you look at this fish, it's got blue scales, it's 3 inches long, it wiggles around. But then there's those lab biologists, and they take that fish and they put it in a jar of formaldehyde and they store it on the shelf and they leave it there forever. And they're trying to preserve it because they want to study it long term. The problem is, though, what's in that jar on the shelf is no longer the fish. It's not alive, it's not swimming, it's not wiggling, it's the wrong color, it's not breathing anymore. And I think about that with stories a little bit, is that for stories and folktales, they're often out sort of in the wild moving around. And we often want to catch them and put them in books, which is a good thing to do, we want to preserve them. But once a story gets into a book, it changes a little bit. It's been sort of stuck down on paper like when you pin a butterfly onto a piece of paper. And it's going to stay preserved forever like that. And the job of the storyteller is to pick that butterfly up and breathe life into it so it flies around. Connected to that a little bit is the difference between stories and science. And I often will tell a folktale, and I got involved in storytelling working as a naturalist because I realized that not every kid loves birds and bugs and bears. Some kids just have no interest in that. But every kid would be interested in hearing a story about a bird or a bug or a bear. And once I told them that story, kind of opened that door in their brain, I could feed them some science. And usually there was science embedded in the story they didn't even see coming that connected later to the class we were teaching. And so it was a hook to get kids interested in animals. But then I always tried to make the leap from that. Okay, here was a story that gave a story answer. Well, animal colors. A long time ago, all the animals in the world were white. White like the snow on the ground, or white like the clouds on a summer day. All the animals were white. And they all liked being that color, except for Beaver. All the trouble happened with Beaver. One day Beaver looked at his paws and said, I don't want to be a white beaver anymore. No, I want to be a purple beaver. Yeah, I want to be a purple beaver. So he got to thinking about how he could get some color. And as he was thinking about that and talking to himself and talking to the other animals, they got the same idea. Deer looked at her legs and said, white is such a bland color. I want something more dramatic. Something like red. Red's the perfect color for deer. I want to be red. And then there were the butterflies. Flap, flap, glide. Flap, flap, glide. Two girl butterflies landed on a branch next to each other, and one went up to the other one and said, it is so hard to find a husband these days. I flapped to another butterfly. It's the wrong kind of butterfly. I can't tell them apart. They all look the same. Well, pretty soon all the animals wanted a different color for their fur or their feathers or their scales because they'd never done this before. They did what people sometimes do when we can't solve a problem. They held a meeting. You've been to some of these meetings, right? Get everyone in a room, get someone really important there. Of course, it was animals, so they weren't in a room. They were out in the woods, big clearing. And they got a really smart animal to lead the meeting. You've probably heard of these animals. They fly around at night. They got big talons on their toes. They're always saying, ooh, ooh. Who's that? Owl. Now, some people say owls are so smart because they fly around at night and see things other animals don't see. Other people say it's because of those great big eyes. Maybe they can like see X-ray vision through other animals. They can't really, but it's kind of cool to think about that. But I like to think that owls are so smart because they're always asking questions. And when you ask questions, you tend to learn things. Well, Owl was walking back and forth in front of all the animals. Who was an idea? who was a suggestion? And the first creature to raise its little paw was the little chipmunk. Hey everybody, I got a really good idea, Great subtraction. What do you guys think about that? Chipmunk had a lot of caffeine that morning. But the animals heard the word color, and that was a word they liked to hear, so they all nodded their heads or their beaks or their bills. But they still didn't have an idea of how to get color. And that's when Eagle raised her great wing and said, hey, you know what? Way up in the sky, there's a big band of color. It goes from one end of the sky all the way to the other. Red, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, all the colors. Next time it rains, we birds will fly up and get colors for our feathers. All the birds nodded their heads. They liked that idea. Walking animals, not so excited. Wait a minute, said Bear. Who's to keep you birds from stealing all the colors? What's going to happen to us animals on the ground? We're going to not get any colors at all. And pretty soon, the birds and the walking animals almost came to blows when Beaver raised his little paw and said, hey guys, I'm a beaver, you know, and we chop down trees. Yeah, if I could find a tree tall enough, I could line it up just right. I could knock those colors right out of the sky. Well, the animals, they liked that idea. They liked it because it was simple. They liked it because they were bringing colors right down to the ground where everybody could get them. But they liked it most of all because Beaver would be doing most of the work. Pretty easy to like a plan when someone else is doing it. And so they waited. And it took a long time. It was one of those summers that's great for baseball and picnics and not so good for rain clouds. But finally, one morning, the animals woke up. And they saw gray clouds in the east. And sure enough, pretty soon they heard a noise. It was kind of a quiet noise to start off, kind of like this. It got a little bit louder, and a lot louder, and it was rain. It came down all over the forest, turning low spots into ponds, and little pathways into streams. Pretty soon it began disappearing until it was quiet again. And the animals, they woke up and looked around, and sure enough, just like Eagle had said, there were colors up in the sky. Beaver crawled out of his lodge, swam up onto the shore, and found a great big maple tree. Trees were a lot taller back then. Landed up just right, began chewing, chomp, 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 chomp. And while Beaver was doing that, animals began to argue about what was the best color for animals. Some thought it was blue, some thought it was yellow, some thought it was green. They had no idea what the best color was, but they were all arguing. And just then they had a crack, and the tree came down and smashed right into the rainbow. Broke it into 1,000 tiny little pieces that rained down all over the world. And the animals took off running or flying or skittering or jumping as fast as they could to get those colors. And the first creatures to get there were the little songbirds flying fast through the forest. Jay grabbed all the blue, Cardinal grabbed the red. Of course, these were all the boy birds getting there. It was spring. Girls had jobs. Next came the bugs. The butterflies came in family groups. All the monarchs decided they'd be orange with black lines. All the tiger swallowtails would be yellow with black lines. And those little cabbage butterflies, the ones you see in August in Minnesota and Wisconsin, well, they said, we like being white. Let's stay that way. By the time the walking animals got there, though, all the bright colors were gone. All the reds and greens and blues. Beaver got there was no purple. Beaver looked around and saw a little chunk of orange sitting in the grass. So he waddled over there, grabbed onto that orange and pulled it out of the grass, but something else pulled it back in and pulled back and forth until it broke. And he realized it broke all over his teeth, and the animal that was playing on the other end, rats. Which is why to this day when you see a beaver or a rat, look at those front teeth, they're bright orange. Of course, Beaver didn't have color for his fur, but he saw some puddles. And you know how it is when you're using watercolors and mix all the colors together? It turns kind of a brownish color. Well, he found this puddle where colors had mixed and thought, well, brown's good enough for me, and so he painted himself brown head to tail. Deer had the same problem. She went out to find red, but the cardinals had it. She thought to herself, hey, if I can't paint myself a dramatic color, I'll paint myself a dramatic way. So she painted her head and her back and her legs kind of a tan brown color. But she left her belly and her tail white, so to this day we call them the white-tailed deer. Now, some people say all the colors didn't go to the animals that day. Some people say they found the cracks in the ground, and every spring they come back up as our wildflowers. I don't know about that part of the story, but I do know that some animals never heard about the plan. To this day, when you go way up into Canada, you find bears and birds and foxes that are still white as snow, because they never heard about the plan on the day that Beaver got colors for the animals. So that's the way it was, and that's the way it is, and that's the end of the story. So there's an example of an animal story. So and I often would use that story then in a class where we're talking about something like camouflage or animal adaptations, because the story had embedded in a lot of information about animal colors. And I'd say after that, okay, I give you a story reason. In the folktale, we had a story reason why animals have colors. Does anybody know a science reason why male birds would have bright colors? And putting those things on the same pedestal, telling people that they're different, you know, there's a story science, or there's a story reason and there's a science reason, kind of gives them both some credibility. Because the other option is, growing up through science, people always would sort of look down on folktales because they weren't science, which they're not. But to explain that they're both useful, that the stories get people interested in animals, which is really important when doing environmental education, and the science piece gives you sort of the how and why of how the science works. And so by putting them both together, it makes it easier to make that connection from a story that was interesting and got their attention to the science you maybe want to feed them later on. And also, if your story has that embedded science in it, let me think of which, sometimes character in a story, if it's an animal character, will be sniffing the air with his nose, because a certain animal, like a wolf or bear, has a great sense of smell. You embed those little kernels of science in there, so that when you talk about them, that refers back to the story. They remember, oh yeah, that bear did that great sense of smell thing. So, good. Any other things that people, maybe one or two more things people wanted to make sure they get out of the next hour?
Sorry, I'm late. I had said I wanted animal sounds. Is that
Mm-hmm.
up there?
And we'll talk about how animals should sound right. And you're not going to necessarily recreate the actual sound of an animal, because, to tell you the truth, almost nobody knows what animals really sound like. What you need to approximate when you're looking at animal sounds is the Muppet version of that animal. Because the Muppets in cartoons are the closest we get to animal sounds and animal voices. And so we'll talk about how do you get that close enough that it works, and that it works for you. Because the more voices you have, the more complicated your life becomes. So figuring out how do you balance all those pieces out. So I want to talk for just a minute about kinds of animal stories, because there are a couple of different kinds of animal stories people can use for various reasons. The first one are the fables and the folktales, and those are the most anthropomorphic of the stories. They're basically Aesop and other storytellers that told those. They were basically using animals as a way not to get their heads chopped off when they told stories. Because if they told stories about human beings, kings and queens, they'd get executed back in those days. And so they used animals because it was safe. And so they're basically stories with people in furry costumes. Which is fine. They're interesting stories. I use Aesop's fables a lot. But what I do with them is I want to make sure they're teaching science. And so I rebuild them in some ways, and so they have embedded science in there. And so it's not just about the lesson, although the lesson is good, but I want to make sure that there's some science that comes through at the same time. One day Turtle was walking down the road, doom-be-doom, doom-be-doom, because that's what turtles do. And Rabbit came zooming by, Sam! Knocked him right off the road. Rabbit must have been in a hurry. Next day, boom-be-doom, boom-be-doom. Sure enough, zoom! Got knocked off the road again. Turtle thought, okay, maybe I'll have a conversation this time. And so Turtle went around a corner a little bit and climbed up onto a big rock, so it was right on the road. And when Rabbit came zooming by, Turtle said, hey, Rabbit, wait! And Rabbit stopped. Turtle looked at Rabbit, and Rabbit said, what do you have going on, Turtle? I'm very, very fast. I have places to go, things to do, people to see. What's going on? What's so important for you? And Turtle looked at Rabbit and said, well, I've been walking down the road, and you keep knocking me off the road, and I'm halfway through the sentence. Rabbit took off again. Couldn't wait. And that got Turtle thinking. If I want to get Turtle to listen to me, I might have to figure out something to do. Well, the next day when Rabbit came by, Turtle didn't wait on the road. He waited at the edge of the river. Because Rabbit would have to figure a way to get across. It would take a little bit of time. Well, while Rabbit was there at the edge of the river, Turtle came up and said, hey, Rabbit, you keep knocking me off the road, and you're always moving so fast. It's not very nice to knock people off the road when you're going so fast. Could you pay attention to where you're going? And Rabbit looked at Turtle. Opened those great big eyes. Had to kind of turn the head side to side to focus in on that turtle sitting there, and put up her big ears and said, well, Turtle, it's not my fault. You're so slow. Turtle looked at Rabbit and said, slow? No. This is as fast as I go. But it's not slow at all. In fact, I challenge you to a race. Tomorrow we'll race from the hill to the river. Whoever gets to the river first wins a great big basket of carrots. And not a lot of people know this unless you raise turtles, but we all know that rabbits love carrots, but turtles do too. Those nice crunchy things for their little beaks. And so they agreed. And the next day they had that race. All the animals were there at the starting line for the race, and they had Fox starting because they figured Fox knew what he was doing. And Fox looked at all the animals and said, okay, on your marks, get set. And he forgot what was next. And so what people sometimes do when they're not sure what's going to happen next is you start over again. On your marks, get set, wait! No, that's not right. And finally the animals, they all get together. You know what he's supposed to say, right? On your marks, get set, go! And suddenly Rabbit took off like a shot, and Turtle, doom-be-doom, doom-be-doom. And his friends got really nervous because Turtle was, of course, going turtle speed. And they said, Turtle, go faster, you're going too slow. And Turtle said, slow? No, this is as fast as I go. And Turtle kept on walking. Doom-be-doom, doom-be-doom. It wasn't long, and Rabbit was running down the path so fast that I was feeling a little sleepy and looked around and thought, Turtle's nowhere around. Here, I'll have a quick little warm nap. Rabbit went sound asleep, curled up in some bushes hidden from the path. And as Turtle kept on walking, doom-be-doom, doom-be-doom. The thing about turtles, they're not real fast. But when you go really slowly, you're really, really quiet. And as Turtle was walking down the path, went right past where Rabbit was sleeping, didn't even bother a whisker on that face, kept on walking. And when the animals saw Turtle putting a foot right into the river, they all cheered, "Hooray, Turtle, yay, Turtle, go ahead, yay, Turtle!" No, it wasn't long. Before that noise woke up Rabbit. Rabbit jumped up and tried to run to the path as fast as could, but it was too late. Turtle had already won. And Rabbit ran up to Turtle and said, "Turtle, Turtle, how in the world did you win a race? You're so slow." And Turtle said, "Slow? No! This is as fast as I go." And that's the end of the story. So, and it's a fable. Lots more anthropomorphism in there, not huge. In the traditional stories, there's no biology, and I try to fit in some pieces here, and depending on the story and lesson I'm doing, I'll try to fit in more pieces. But, you know, if you're talking about adaptations, rabbits obviously have fast, springy legs for running really fast. Turtles don't have those. Well, why not? They don't need them. If you're a turtle and you're in danger, you pull your head and tail into your shell and you're fine. You look kind of funny with rabbit legs on a turtle body anyway. You know, so that story can do some biology, teaching about how the animals move. We talked about sounding right and moving right and having a reason for behavior and seeing the world through their own eyes. What sounds and movements did you see in that story for the characters?
Rabbit
Doom-be-doom.
I like that a lot.
both eyes.
You do, yeah. Having a sound for an animal as they move, and rabbit turning his head back and forth. Yeah, rabbits, their eyes on the side of their heads, and this is true of most prey animals. If you're going to be eaten by something, your eyes aren't on the front of your head. We're predators, unfortunately. We're meat-eating predators. Our eyes are on the front of our heads, so we can reach out and grab things and eat them. We have depth of perception. Virtually anything that gets eaten, cows, sheep, horses, their eyes are on the sides of their heads, so they have wide-angle vision. They have terrible binocular vision. They can't reach out and grab things as easily. But when you eat grass, it's not going to move. So pretty easy. But yeah, that's finding a movement that the animal makes that you can put into your story. And usually I pick maybe just one. You don't want a million of them because then it complicates your life. But watch animals at a zoo or at a park and watch what they're doing. Are there some movements there that you can fit in, even just in small ways? Sometimes if it's a small animal, people will do snakes with their arm because they're easy to do. Turning your head side to side for a rabbit, because that's one of those little things that they do, and you don't have to necessarily talk a lot about it, but then if you're doing more teaching about animals later on, you can refer back to that piece. Remember how rabbit had to turn his head back and forth to focus? Well, that's because these are where the eyes are. Sure. How about sounding right? What kind of voices did we have for characters? Or way the voice happened?
Fast or slow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, generally speaking, with what sounds right to us when we think about animals has to do with heart rate. And the faster your heart rate, the higher your voice. And this comes from cartoon Speedy Gonzales. And those sorts of characters, the smaller an animal, the faster its heart beats. The bigger an animal, the slower its heart beats. So elephants' hearts beat slower than ours do. And we tend to interpret that as being related to how fast they talk. Probably not a lot of biology with that, but it makes sense to us. It connects with people's brains. If you were trying to do an elephant and a really high voice for an elephant, it just wouldn't work. There's too much cognitive dissonance in your brain. Like, is that really an elephant? It sounds like a mouse. So it's easy you can change some things in stories, but shifting a voice that far, it gets to be hard. You can do it, but it's a challenge. So it's easier to have the tone of the voice high or low, and the speed of the voice connecting up with things like body size and heartbeat. The bigger animal, the deeper the voice generally. Smaller the animal, the higher the voice. And then the rate of speaking is related there too. The faster your heart beats, the faster you're going to tend to talk. Also though, sometimes, if it's a rate that's a lot faster, a lot slower than your normal voice, it can complicate your story. It can be hard to tell it all the way through. So sometimes I'll make a point of having that animal voice really show you at the beginning of the story, and then maybe not work on it as much later on in the story when other activities are happening. So that's something you can play with a little bit too. In the story with lots of animals, animal colors, did anybody notice how many different animal voices there were with all those different animals?
Just a couple.
Yeah. Once you get past 2, it gets pretty tough, keeping track of all those pieces. And you have a couple of voices to work with. You have your own regular voice, regular speaking storytelling voice, and then if you add 1 or 2 more animals, that's 3 different voices for you to work with, and that should probably do it. In most Aesop's fables, you don't have many more than 2 or 3 animals. But you don't want a million voices, because that's going to complicate your life. You might pick just one character. You know, the main character might get a special voice, or the main character might get your regular voice, and then the main supporting character, co-star character, might get a special animal voice, depending on what's going on. Yeah. Thinking back to that first story, the animal colors story, what movement things did you see in that story? What body language things happened with the animal
I
characters?
like the butterflies.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
The
The
flap
fly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these stories, I guess both of these that I'm telling, probably the ones that I'll tell later on, are all what I consider mature stories. Mature stories are stories that I've told probably 20, 30, 40 times at least. I always think about stories as going through a growth stage. You sort of plant a little seed, and that's the first time of telling the story. And it's a pretty basic plotline story. But then each time you tell it, it gets better and better. And don't worry about all these things right now. Don't think that you have to start an animal story and you got to get the voice right and the movements and have a reason and all those pieces. Generally, they'll happen on their own the more you tell an animal story. And so the best way to tell a good animal story is, like most skills, is just do it over and over and over again. If you work at a school or a nature center where you have lots of opportunities to tell the same stories over and over, that's a great place. That's where I did a lot of my building stories, was in those places, because then, right around the 10th, 15th telling, voices just pop up all by themselves. And you're not really thinking and saying, okay, this animal should have a high voice, this animal should have a low voice. They just sort of show up. And so a lot of these will take care of themselves. If you want to create them, and build them at the start, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they'll start showing up on their own as they go, too. And also, it'll depend a little bit, the reason for the behavior of the animal, and those things might have to do with what your other goals are. So if you're teaching at a nature center or a school where you're trying to teach animal science through your stories, then these things are going to be more important to talk about the reason for behavior and those pieces. If you're using these stories as part of a program that maybe not teaching as much about biology, they might not be as high a priority, if that makes sense. So fables are generally short, lots of great opportunities to stick in science because there's no science there. Get Ben.
One thing I appreciated was when your slower animals were speaking, they weren't stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Turtle isn't dumb,
Right.
and I like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, going back and looking at those archetypes, because they're often, and part of it, we've often connected animal behavior and human behavior, and that's one that people think about. If you speak slowly, the assumption is you're not as intelligent. And so animals that move slowly, we often think aren't as intelligent, but turtles have been around since before the dinosaurs. They've outlived dinosaurs and they're still around, so clearly there's something about a turtle that works. And even, so yeah. And also that gives you an opportunity to work against archetypes there. And I often try to do that. With animals, there are lots of archetypes of what an animal is like, what we think it's like from television and movies. And also, to remember how, in the characters, almost always, and this is, at least in the US, it's a really common trait. When you're referring to an animal, and you're not sure what its gender is, what do we assume in America? Male, always. And that's partly English. We were taught in school that if you're not sure the gender of a character, you always say he. And so as much as I can, and even in Aesop's fables, almost every Aesop's fables, unless there's a reason for it to be a female character, which is pretty rare, they always give he's. And so when doing animal stories, looking at those archetypes again, I try as much as I can to flip that, and so that you're giving she's automatically. And as much as I can, I try to give the she's heroic roles in the story, because that's pretty rare too, and so flipping those stereotypes. Mm-hmm.
I ran into a story recently where there is a bird, and the bird is in the process of building a nest, and it was consistently a he, and there was really no reason for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't say what type of a bird it was, but when I tell the story, I started calling it a she because it made more sense to me.
Yeah, and there's no biology reason. There's only one story I think that I do that it has to be a he, and it's deer's antlers, an Aesop's fable. And white-tailed deer, only the males have antlers, so you really can't get around that one. But everything else, yeah, you can almost always switch gender. Another category for these sorts of stories are the myths and legends, and they tend to be stories used more in environmental education because they often answer those why questions in an interesting way. Why bear has a short tail, why deer has antlers, those sorts of things. And we often think traditionally that those stories, that most of the why stories about animals come from North America, from First Nations or Native people of North America. And it is true, there are lots of those stories from those groups, but virtually every culture has those stories if you look around. And well, Europe has them too. If you look in the fringes of Europe, Finland, Norway, you can find little bits of them. The rest of it went up in smoke, but that's a whole different story. But the tradition going back hundreds and probably thousands of years is people would pick up a story in one country, take it to somewhere else, change the animals to be the local animals, and then retell the story again. And so you see that happening again and again. Most recently, you see stories from Nigeria ending up in the American South with African Americans and then moving to other parts of the US. And so that's completely a part of the tradition. And so if you can't find stories that are working, in your area about your animals, one of the big challenges I ran into initially was I was looking for stories about North American animals, and I could find some, but they didn't quite work for whatever reason. And I thought, okay, what do? You got to create your own? Well, not always. You could look around at other countries and see what their animal stories were about and find similar animals. And so one good example of that is last night, Turtles Tug of War. There's a Nigerian version of that story, there's a South Carolinian version, and then the version I told involved animals from Minnesota. And in Nigeria, it was an elephant and I think a hippopotamus. And so I thought, okay, if I'm going to bring that story here, what are the analogous animals? And then it helps to know biology because you have to think, okay, well, let's see, an animal that is really big and it's in the water. Well, the only big water animal we have here is moose in Minnesota. And so that was pretty easy. A big animal that's on land, okay, bears work for that. But trying to find them that sort of have the same body size that they fit with the story, and then that can work, and you can swap those animals pretty clearly. Birds are even easier to swap unless they're something really particular like an eagle. But we have eagles here, they have eagles in other countries. So you can often swap those animals and redo them, and it's well known in the tradition that we do that.
That being a common theme, is
Race.
really nice as well. I tell one from the rainforest people in South America, and the turtle, jabuti, has two of them to tug of war with at one time. And in the water we have whale, and in the forest we have tapir. So they just get all of it together going at the same time, and he beats them all.
Right, yeah. They don't have anything much bigger than tapirs, do they? Yeah, South America, they don't have the big, really big mammals. So, okay, yeah.
Kevin, do you ever find that whenever you're taking a story like a myth or legend from one culture to another, that you can have the same animal but have totally different cultural characteristics? Like, for instance, an eagle, in American culture, an eagle is this noble animal. They're really not that noble. They're,
Well, they eat dead stuff.
Yeah. They're more, they're closer to turkey vultures than anything. And do you find that happening when you go from one culture to another, where the animal's the same but the characteristics are very different?
But is there a culture that revere the eagle?
That's what I'm thinking. Is there a culture where it would be more true to science?
No.
Okay.
These stories were made long before we understood science about animals, so not so much. It's surprising how universal, a lot of attitudes about animals are. Mosquitoes are always bad, and snakes are almost always bad. If you look, they're very few. Well, they're hard to find. They're pre-Hellenic, really, really early. Sumerian stories, you'll find one or two positive snake stories out there, but other than that, the idea that snakes are evil characters is universal, Christian and non-Christian.
Okay.
I mean, you often think that European folktales, it's because of the Christian attitudes about certain animals, wolves being bad and that sort of thing. And it's true. I mean, there are definitely stories across Europe where wolves are negative characters, but as I began digging up stories, if you go just past the Christian margin in northern Finland, suddenly wolves are positive again. And in Japan, wolves are positive. And so you can find, I guess you can find some cultural differences in how they treat animals, and it has to do with how people were living when the stories were put down. And so Europe, we had livestock eaten by wolves. There was a good reason to not like wolves. Finland, they weren't raising livestock. They had reindeer, but reindeer could hold their own against wolves. Japan, they didn't have livestock much at all, and so the wolves there, they used to leave. I'm spacing on grains. Rice would be grown. What else would they grow in Japan in the Middle Ages? Big sheaves of something. Wouldn't be corn. I'm spacing on the plant. Anyway, they leave a big sheaf left in the field a lot of times in Japan historically, and that was the wolf sheaf. And they talked about how wolves are good because they'd eat the deer, and the deer would eat the crops. And so, wolves are seen as a positive thing, where so many farming cultures in Europe, it was a negative thing because they raised cattle. But in Japan, it was not that way at all. They saw, wolves as a positive character.
Okay. Talking about Christianity, I ran into this problem, and I don't know if you've encountered this before, telling porcoa stories of, why an animal is a certain way. I've had parents complain to my boss saying that God created the animals that way, and I shouldn't be telling those stories.
Yeah, you mostly have to ignore those people. I mean, there's no way around it.
Hurts my brain.
Yeah. Well, another thing that when people have come up to a concert afterwards and said, these teacher stories aren't really real, are they? I mean, you can get into a debate with them, but it's not going to go anywhere. Sometimes I'll answer, well, there are lots of different stories, but yeah, there's not a good way around that. And the thing is that where Christian fables and folktales try to do those explainings, they're not very good. They were. You tend to know a good folktale because it's been passed down hundreds and hundreds of years through generations, and you have sort of a feel to it. The few wise stories, there are a couple of stories about Jesus touching a bird and changing the color and those sorts of things, and it seems like the student that had 5 minutes to write their report and they wrote it really fast and just put down something and handed it in. The people that were working on those stories, they don't work right, and part of it is that they're not the whole story. That there was an older traditional story, and they lopped off the parts they didn't like, and they stuck a Christian theme, and they tried to hand it out, and it doesn't work anymore. But what you can do, though, is work backwards. If you have a little piece of that story, see if you can find earlier versions that were pre-Christian, and often there's a more interesting story back there. But yeah, that's going to be a tough one to do. Luckily, if you work at nature centers or zoos, they have some policies around science teaching, and you can talk about how you can't talk about creationism because we teach science here. We can't teach religion. We're not a religion teacher, and so you can have some flexibility that way. And you can also use the folktale to talk about here's a story people have told for a long time about these animals to help them understand the animals, and then that avoids it's a cultural experience, not a religious experience. But yeah, that is every once in a while a touchy subject. Yeah. Let's see. So fables and folktales and myths and legends are things we're fairly familiar with. Another category that maybe, unless you're doing science education, you're not as familiar with is the histories and natural histories about animals. Because there are some great stories that are actual factual historical stories about animals and plants, and some of them actually have happened right in our lifetime, which is great. Think back to the 60s, we had eagles that were really, really rare because we used this great chemical called DDT, which was great. Got rid of mosquitoes, saved hundreds or thousands of lives in the Pacific during World War II. Great chemical. Unfortunately, it got passed through the food system. Animals would eat it, and then they'd get eaten by something, and they'd eat the chemical, and they'd pass that chemical all the way to eagles, who would then eat it. And female eagles laid eggs that were really thin, and when the mother sat on the eggs, they broke, and the eaglets died. Luckily for us, we figured it out, and we banned the chemical, at least in this country, and suddenly eagles are coming back, and now there are eagles nesting not far from my house in Rochester, Minnesota, which is a fairly urban area, but we have eagles there. You see them all up and down the Mississippi. You can take that sort of a piece and talk about with science education and environmental education. Often we're telling the other side. We used to have lots of these birds, and now they're gone. We used to have these great forests, and now it's gone. And unfortunately, those stories just leave people feeling sad, and they're not sure what to do. Because if you can't solve a problem, you can't engage in a problem, we tend to try to ignore the problem. But if you tell a story of, here was a problem we had, these animals were disappearing, so we did this and this and this, and now they're back. Boy, we did a good thing. That lets your listeners hear that we can solve problems, that there are steps we can take. I always like to remind people regulations are a good thing. Sometimes people get really nervous about regulations. We can't, have those rules and regulations. But, in Minnesota right now, it's really funny. We're talking about having a 50-foot grass buffer between a farm field and a river. And I work for a watershed group, so this is an issue that we talk about all the time. And there's this big debate that, well, it's a one-size-fits-all, solution. We can't just put grass boundaries there. We have to have all. And I always think when people talk about one-size-fits-all boundaries and regulations, how many of us drove on a highway? That's a one-size-fits-all regulation. I see a speed limit. I don't get to go 75. I get to go 65. Anyway, so but showing how people can get together and talk and solve problems is a really powerful thing when talking about animals, and that we can do a positive thing about that. And eagles are a great way to do that. There are also some really funny stories about wildlife. One that I told for a while and I thought was true. And then I was pretty certain it couldn't have been true as I tried to research it. And then, thanks to Barbara Schutz-Gruber, she found it actually is true. In Montana, we trapped beavers all across North America because of those beautiful beaver hats that were in the 1600s and 1700s. Every man that was rich wanted several beaver hats. And we trapped them through Minnesota and Wisconsin, and there weren't very many in the Dakotas, but then out in the mountains. And in Montana, they trapped out their beavers, and they realized without beavers building dams and holding up the water in ponds, they'd get lots of erosion, and so they were getting these big eroded gullies down the sides of the mountains. And so in the 60s, the biologists looked at this, and I said, well, what are we missing? And they realized, beavers, there are no beavers here. And they have huge tracts of forest land there, and they thought, okay, we have to get beavers, but these are 40, 50-pound mammals with huge teeth that like to bite people. We're not going to carry them in there. There are no roads. What are you going to do? And so someone there clearly had a creative idea, and he said, parachutes. They loaded up beavers into these special cages.
What else could there be?
Right. Loaded, put parachutes on them, flew over the mountains in Montana, and pushed the crates out. And as the crates came down, the parachute popped open, and they slowly settled to the ground. And these beavers, when the cage hit the ground, the door popped open, and the beaver waddled out and started doing what beavers always do in Montana. They cut down trees, they built ponds, and you see them there to this very day. The great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of those beavers are still out there, and all because they were parachuted in a long time ago. So then there's stories
They all
like that.
speak with a Canadian accent.
I can imagine they were slightly dizzy when they got down to their ground.
They probably were. Well, and Barbara was telling me that they had to practice to see if beavers would survive the crash. And so there was this one beaver, she was like the test beaver, and that dropped the parachute down, and it would pop open, and it would come out, and it would look around a little bit and go back into the cage, because they knew he was just going to pick it up and take it back, and put it in the airplane and drop it off.
And multiple missions.
Right, yeah. So those sorts of stories can be really useful too, because they're actual historic events that have to do with wildlife, and we have lots of those now. Because of the Endangered Species Act, the role of what's happened with wolves in Minnesota and in Wisconsin and North America. And it's really funny. My wife used to work for the International Wolf Center, and they still are wonderful people who firmly believe that science will undo folkloric fears of wolves. They're absolutely wrong about that. They never will. Only folklore will combat folklore, but eventually they'll figure that out. But they were always talking about, wolves surviving in Minnesota, and now we're way past that. Wolves have done so well in Minnesota that there's a hunting season occasionally. Now they've gone off the hunting season list. But L. David Beach is a famous wolf biologist, and people ask him, well, what do you think about a hunt? Should we be hunting wolves? And they're on lots of wildlife issues, there's a big spectrum of opinion, but some folks believe in saving each individual wolf, and so hunting seasons would be terrible because you're shooting individual wolves. Other folks look at it as a population. We want the population to survive, and individuals, they die all the time from car accidents and all sorts of things. And then there are the folks that don't want wolves anyway because for various reasons they're nervous about their children being carried away or those sorts of things. And so L. David Beach was asked, what do you think about the hunting season? And he's like, I don't think it'll ever work. We could shoot as many as we want. We're not going to get rid of them. Because the only way we ever got rid of wolves is when we had open season. You could shoot them any time of the year, and you could put out hundreds of carcasses full of strychnine poison all over the forest. And we're never going to do that again. because we killed millions of other animals that ate the poison too, along with the wolves. But that was a really intense process. The hunting season, he says that we shoot more wolves illegally every year than we do with the hunting season. And so what the hunting season did is we'll just shoot fewer wolves illegally, because when people see a wolf and don't like it, they'll shoot it during hunting season or they'll shoot it another time and bury it. And so there's no impact. And so it was really interesting, his perspective, that we're not good enough at hunting wolves to get rid of them anymore. I mean, they're here for good, and the issue is going to be how do you manage them? What happens when they move into farm country and they start eating cattle, and that's a whole different issue in Minnesota. But it was an interesting perspective that wolves, once they get to a certain point, will be doing just fine. And we've never lost a species that we hunt. If you look at white-tailed deer and all those populations are doing great. And so the idea of hunting wolves, at least from my perspective, is if you hunt it, then it has value and you take care of it. If it's just a creature that is a vermin species like coyotes, we try to kill coyotes, it doesn't work. Which is a funny thing about folklore coyotes and real-life coyotes. They found biologically, they found out that and we tried to kill them all the ways we do wolves, and it doesn't work in coyotes for bizarre reasons. We can't figure it out. But they did a study on coyotes once, and they found that when they had a strict hunting season or a massive hunting season where they shot them every time they saw them, you kill the parents. And suddenly they realized that the parents controlled breeding behavior in the pups. And so the pups wouldn't breed till they were 3 or 4 or 5 years old with the parents around. Well, shoot the parents, they start breeding it too. And so you kill the parents and they breed faster. And what an amazing biology tool that you do that. So anyway. Any questions about those categories of animal stories? If you're looking for a short story that has animals in it, fables are great to use. Sometimes the shorter folk tales will work too. Longer stories are stories that are sort of answering why questions are going to tend to be legends, and some folk tales will do that too. The why piece, if that's important to what you're doing. And sometimes there'll be more than one why in a story. That's the Norwegian story about how a bear got a short tail talks about why bears have short tails. There's also a piece of it that talks about why bears hibernate, and another piece of it talks about the Big Dipper. And so sometimes you'll have several of those pieces depending on what you're trying to do. All right. Now our next step is going to be strengthening animal storytelling. We talked a little bit about the sound right, move right, have a reason for behavior, and see the world through their own eyes. And the first thing to know about animals is stories happen somewhere. And so you want to try to get your habitat right as much as possible. And so it's, for most animals, fairly easy. If it's an Aesop's fable, it probably grew up in Greece historically and southern Europe, and so forests there are in some ways kind of like forests here. I mean, the forest environment works pretty well. But if you're doing some animals, an animal that's obviously an ocean animal, you've got to have the ocean there. You can't just use a lake. So trying to get the habitat right is important. What sort of place would the animal be living in? Because otherwise, sometimes with Aesop's fables and the illustrated versions, you'll get pictures of the animals, wearing 19th century clothes and living in a house, and that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not teaching animal biology. And so I'll sometimes, if I'm going to do a version of, remake versions of traditional folk tales, I'll try to, as much as possible, make it as a natural setting as possible. And so I've sometimes tried to play around with Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and the bears aren't living in houses, but they're living in a cave that has some amenities that the girl comes and finds. She finds a pile of berries they left on a rock and that sort of thing. So you can do that. There's nothing wrong with shifting those pieces and seeing if it works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But trying to make it as natural a setting as possible. And also, historically, if you're working at an outdoor nature center, you've got lots of opportunities. But setting the story as close as physically possible to where you are seems to work really, really well. When I was working in northern Minnesota, if I told a story about elephants in Africa, it didn't quite work because it was too far away. And so stories feel like they work better when they feel they happen closer. When you can say, down the road, or the woods just up the hill over there. That, for some reason in our brains, that works pretty well for animal stories. So having a setting, especially a setting people are familiar with, because then they can get a sort of sense of where it is. If they don't know about a particular habitat, then you want to try to share at least a little bit about that habitat so they know, is it a prairie, is it a forest, is it a lake? because we have basic ideas about those from summer camp or other experiences. But try to find, give a little bit about the habitats. So I know that the animal lives in a place, and animals actually live in very, very specific places. It's not by accident that certain animals show up in certain places. Every habitat has the things an animal needs: food, water, shelter, and space, right in that area. And so that's why you don't see, polar bears in Minnesota. They don't have the right resources there. There are no seals to eat in Minnesota, and way too warm. But they all have those physical tools and adaptations to survive in their own environment. And that leads us to why they act the way they do. And animals act the way they do for a certain reason. A lot of times in folktales they don't explain those reasons. It just, bear is really, really hungry, so he steals fish from fox. Or wolf is really, really mean and hungry because he's an evil guy, so he's going to eat all the goats. They don't really quite explain those pieces. And so when trying to do animal characters, I try to figure out, how do you do that? How do you give an explanation for why things are the way they are? And the reason for behavior, usually for animals, tends to be biology. How are they built? Predators have to eat things. If you're a meat eater, you gotta eat meat. And so that's often in folklore why they end up being villains, because they're gonna kill something. That's their job. And because folktales were written down in a time period in which Europeans, at least, were settled farmers with cattle. And so their job was culturally to defend their cattle against those evil wild animals that were coming to steal their cattle and eat them up. If those stories were captured and put down on paper, 3 or 4 or 5,000 years earlier, when humans were hunter-gatherers, the attitudes about wolves would have been very different than they are right now. But part of it's just cultural when they got put down. But there is a way to deal with, if you have a character that is always, shown in a negative light because they're a hunter, you can sometimes find folktales that fix that problem. You might have to look a little bit harder and farther to see them. But when I was working and doing storytelling programs at the International Wolf Center, I, of course, was looking for folktales that went against the Little Red Riding Hood story, because that one, it's stunning how pervasive that is. When people are surveyed, to this day in Minnesota, I think like 48% of people, when they talk about wolves, I'm worried my child will be carried away by the wolf. Okay, it's never happened in Minnesota. A healthy wild wolf, for years we could say a healthy wild wolf had never attacked a human in North America. Now I think because the wolves are in Yellowstone and people put like hamburgers on the end of their fingers and reach out to wolves. We've been luring wolves into campsites. And so we've had a couple of cases of wolves biting hands they're trying to feed them, which is a terrible idea.
Evolution in action.
Right, it is, yeah. But anyway, so the folklore is really, really embedded,
Domesticated them.
Right. Well,
On the wheel.
and that's the other piece is we love nature. We have this innate connection to nature, and so some people, they want to have those wonderful wolf-dog hybrids in their house, thinking, oh, this is wonderful, this is wildness, and I can be, like an outdoorsman like Davy Crockett, and isn't this great? Forgetting that wolves have 10,000 years of special breeding, so they listen to us. Dogs have 10,000 years of breeding, so they listen to us. Having worked with wolves, I know wolves do not listen. And they might, if we're really lucky, they see us as equals. If not, they see us as, not equals, subordinate, which is a bad thing. You don't want a wolf seeing you as a subordinate. And so we'd have, children in houses with wolf-dog hybrids, and bad things happen. So looking at folklore, looking at wolf stories. Pardon?
Sounds like middle school.
It could be.
Alpha. Yeah.
So I was looking around for a story that's positive about wolves. And heading north up into Finland, they had this great story. And then I looked around and dug around some more and found pieces of it and pieced it together. But in Finland, there's a wizard named Väinämöinen. And Väinämöinen made the world. And they say when he was done making the world, he wanted to show it off to someone. But the people, well, they were too busy being people, raising crops and building houses. But he could tell Tuani. See, Tuani, he was a wizard kind of like Väinämöinen. Well, not exactly like him. You see, he was also called the Lord of the Dead. He lived across the Dead River in a dark cave, and, well, he came to this world to cause trouble every once in a while. But they both knew magic, so Väinämöinen went to Tuani and said, hey, Tuani, what do you think of this great world I made? And Väinämöinen said, that's okay. Okay? What do you mean okay? Isn't it perfect? Look at those beautiful birch trees, shimmering leaves, those creeks full of silvery fish. It's perfect, right? And Tuani looked around with his one good eye and thought, yeah. You see those deer over there in the woods? When summer comes, and then fall and winter, they're going to eat all the trees in your forest. There'll be nothing left. Vandermoinen said, "Oh, no problem. I made bear and snake to keep the deer out of the forest." "Yeah, but don't they sleep in the wintertime, Vandermoinen?" "Oh yeah, forgot about that." "Hey, Tuani, since you saw the problem, why don't you see a solution? Could you go make a creature to chase the deer out of the forest in the wintertime?" And Tuani got thinking to himself, hey, this could be a good deal. He thought, I'll do it for you on one condition. See, my magic, it can only kill things, can't bring them to life, so I want you to give me some of your magic. And then I'll make a creature for you. What do you say? "Sure," said Vandermoinen. "When you're done making your creature, whisper into its ear, 'Up and devour the evil one.' Say that, and the creature will spring to life." Tuani stomped off down the hill toward the land of the dead, rubbing his hands, saying, "We'll see who gets eaten this time, Vandermoinen." He went down to a village of the humans and got a great big roof beam and put it on his shoulder.
Is there a backstory there we don't know?
Oh yeah. He went down.
This
Yes.
time.
He went down to the blacksmith and got 2 handfuls of nails and stuffed them into his pockets, and went to the forge and got 2 glowing coals and put them in the palm of his hand. He went out to the woods and gathered up gray moss off the rocks and took all these things to his cave. Put down the roof beam for a backbone, got some white stones to make the legs and the bones and the ribs. Took that gray moss to be the fur and the flesh. The iron nails were the claws and the teeth, and the 2 glowing coals were the eyes. And when he was done making the creature, he whispered into its ear, "Up and devour Vandermoinen." Didn't work. Didn't you hear me? "Up and devour Vandermoinen." Didn't work. And now Tuani got mad. He thought, Vandermoinen lied to me. Those aren't magic words at all. So he grabbed the creature and stomped back to Vandermoinen's house and pounded on the door. And when Vandermoinen opened the door, he saw this big gray creature sitting there on the ground. "Tuani, is that the creature?" It's not moving." "Of course it's not moving, Vandermoinen. Your magic didn't work. I did another piece of magic." "Well, Tuani, maybe it's the way you're saying the words. You know, the way you say something is at least as important as what you're saying. Let me hear how you say the words." Tuani hadn't counted on that, but he bent over and whispered as quietly as he could, "Up and devour Vandermoinen." Still didn't work. Now, even though Vandermoinen, with a beard down to his belt, was an old man, he had great hearing. And he heard what Tuani was saying. He said, no, the last part of that last word is clearly wrong. You should be saying, "Up and devour the evil one." Bring! The creature began to move. It looked over at Tuani and over at Vandermoinen and back at Tuani again. And a growl rumbled out of its throat like thunder. Tuani said, "Oh, Vandermoinen, the creature's moving now. My job is done. See you later. Bye." And he ran off. And the creature turned and ran right after Tuani, biting at the heels of his leather boots. Vandermoinen called after him, "Tuani, what's the name of the creature you made?" But all he heard Tuani yelling was, "Stop, wolf! Stop, wolf! Stop, wolf!" He figured the creature's name wasn't Stop. So it must be called Wolf, and that's the name we have for it today. And that night, Vandermoinen heard for the first time a Now in Finland, the grandmothers, they tell this story and they remind their children, if you hear a howl, don't worry. That's just Wolf doing his job, chasing deer out of the forests in the wintertime. But even if he's not doing that, he's doing his other job, chasing Tuani, the evil one, keeping him moving all the time so he can't cause too much trouble in any one place. And someday, he might just catch him. And that's the end of the story. So that's an example of finding a story that is, working against that archetype. Because wolves are going to be hunters no matter what. You're not going to turn a wolf into a grass eater. It's not going to happen. But there's value. In biology, we always talk about, all the different animals have a job to do in nature. And if you pull one out, like when we pulled wolves out of Yellowstone, we saw the elk get really, really fat and stay in the valley all the time. And they ate all the trees. And the beavers didn't have any place to live, so the beavers disappeared. And now the wolves came back, and which is actually a science story, I guess. The wolves came back, and suddenly the elk had to move because they were being chased around. And the trees began to grow again in the valley. And then the beaver came in and began building dams and creating habitat. And suddenly they see the the number of species in Yellowstone is growing because just that addition of one animal. They call that a keystone species in biology. Elephants are another animal that does that. They tear down parts of the forest that provide food for other animals, and wolves will kill animals and eat part of them and then provide food for other species. And so often there's that really critical animal in the system. And so finding a story that tells what you want, working against an archetype. Even though wolves are still ferocious in the story, they're ferocious for a good reason. They're doing an important job. And you need a ferocious animal every once in a while. And so showing those pieces can be a way to work against that archetype. Any questions about that story piece?
No, a lot of I'm a city girl, you know, I don't tell wolf stories. I tell cats, I tell birds, sometimes I have chickens. But I do have a story with a cat in it that's going after the birds. And one of the things I like to say is that I don't want you to think badly of the cat because it was chasing the birds. It's in the nature of cats to chase birds and eat mice and then go on from there, because I don't want to vilify the cat, it just is what it is.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, and also talking about seeing the world through the animal's eyes, on page 3 of your handout, the big chart here, can give you some of that basic biology for non-naturalists in the group. And you can add that in. You're doing a great example of that. And you could even, if you wanted to expand it even a little bit more, talk about, you know, when Cat saw a mouse scurry across the floor, you know, his eyes grew really big and his mouth started to salivate. You know, I'm talking about sort of how their internal sections are and how that relates. Another important piece of animal storytelling is to help people relate to the animal, not so much the anthropomorphic way, because that can work some too, but you know, we have a lot of the same drives. We get hungry, we have to find food, we have to worry about shelter, we generally care for our young, although some animals don't. But you know, making that connection of showing that it was a natural thing for the cat, just like it's a natural thing for us to eat chips or hamburgers or whatever we're eating. So this can give you some of that physical traits and ecological relationships and symbolism piece. The stories that I use a lot working in environmental ed, I try to fit in ecological relationships as much as possible in the story. Some folktales come with ecological relationships, some absolutely don't. Let me think what I said. Oh, well, the Vadermunden and the First Wolf is a great example of one that has an embedded ecological relationship. Wolves chase and eat deer. And so that was in the story, I didn't have to do anything about it, it was great. Aesop's Fables, there's not a lot of ecological relationships built in there. Stories like Tortoise and Hare. Tortoise and hare don't really spend a lot of time together in the natural world. Not a lot of attention. Crane and fox, you know, there are lots of stories where they just sort of put animals together because of the symbolism and not any biological relationship. But you can find stories that do that, or you can adjust stories and change them so that there's more of a relationship, and that seems to work better. Especially if you want to teach science and have ecology in your story, because it makes sense then. Let's see. In the animal colors story, there's some ecological, not a ton of them in there. Yeah. I don't know where I was going with that. So let's see, talk about those pieces. We talked a little bit about sounds, but not so much about movements. And so now, we've been sitting for a while here, so it's time to get up and move. On your sheet right here, we have a whole list of animals. You don't have to use one of these animals, but here on the list you have lots of animals to use if you'd like to. And I want you to think about, if you were telling a story about one of the animals on the list here, I want you to think about how you might move to be that animal. You can think in general terms. We talked about the voice sounds, you know, that bigger animals tend to have low voices, smaller animals tend to have higher voices. Smaller animals tend to talk faster. Bigger animals or turtles tend to talk slowly, a little bit. Size can be the same way. You know, bigger animals, we tend to move your body bigger, stand up taller. Little animals, we tend to do a little more crouching. But think about that a little bit. You know, if you were going to portray, pick one of these animals, and in just a little while, we're going to have you get up and kind of move around and try out your animal a little bit. And then if there are folks that want to share that with the group, we'll do that after that. So any questions about that? You're going to choose an animal and try to get a sense for, if you were going to perform that animal, what are some things you could do to be that animal? Any questions? Okay, go ahead. You can go to corners of the room. You don't have to do it right in the middle of the room. Or if you're stuck,
So,
Sure.
can I ask a question?
Sure. Mosquitoes and sounds of mosquitoes that he does. Yeah. Would one other person like to do it, Jennifer?
So I have bats in my house.
Oh, okay.
So
And your belfry?
You have a belfry?
belfry too, you know, it's like, that's a whole nother story. No, it's an old house and they come and go. So we've been living with them for years, so but it's hard to do a bat really, but they kind of. But as I was telling Bev, the other part of it involves me and my tennis racket. That's the other part of it. You know, fine outside, fine in my attic, fine in the basement, stay out of my bedroom.
Boundaries are good, yeah. So we covered a lot of the sort of sound right and move rights. We'll talk a little bit about the have a reason for being, and the senses part, seeing the world through their eyes can be one of the most interesting additions to make to a story. They're really easy to make, actually. And that's why you have your chart on here, is some of the physical traits, including how they see the world. Because animals, you can almost guarantee animals do not see the world the way that we do. In general, mammals, if you had to characterize mammals, we're a weird mammal. But mammals, generally speaking, don't have color vision. They've got a great sense of smell, but often are nearsighted for some mammals. They tended to be, in the geological and fossil record, nocturnal animals, and so you can be out at night. You don't need color vision because there's no color anyway. You want to be able to smell your food because you can't see it very well, and so there are historical, ecological, evolutionary reasons for that. But that's generally where we're at, and so bears, wolves, foxes, their sense of smell is going to be way better than ours. And so when I do, How Bear Lost His Tail, I have Bear doesn't see fox coming with the path, he smells the fish that fox is carrying. And that's just a small piece, but as I was doing this, I thought, okay, that makes a lot more sense for that character. And Bear looking down with his nearsighted eyes, because bears have terrible vision, even though they're big animals. And but then if you look at the bird world, if you're a predator like an eagle or a hawk, you have these enormous eyeballs. Your eyes are bigger than your brain, and you have phenomenal vision, but aren't the smartest creatures, which may or may not show up in your story. Birds almost always have color vision. Probably have a terrible sense of smell. Don't have a whole lot of sense of taste. And so think about that with your characters. Birds more likely will see something or hear it. They also have a great sense of hearing before they're going to smell it or taste it. And so adding just those little pieces in can make your animals more three-dimensional to your listeners and also more interesting. Having those little piece of facts, you're not just talking about people in a bear suit, you're talking about the real animal that sees the world or smells the world through this way. And it can also help you solve problems in the story by being able to explain them biologically rather than it just sort of happened that way. Any questions about senses and those pieces? Because then that gets us to, with 12 minutes left, the 5 pitfalls of animal storytelling. There's always downsides and dangers. One is animals become two-dimensional stereotypes. And we see this in written folktales already. We already have the stereotyping clearly done for us. And so if that works for you, if it works in the kind of telling you're doing, go ahead, it's already there, no problem. But these stereotypes are often getting so embedded that they're becoming cliches that they're not interesting anymore. Yesterday, Jenna Stelnegger was talking about cliches, and a lot of animal stories like wolf being mean. How many times have we heard stories like that? And so it's often more interesting to try to either find other stories that don't show animals acting the stereotypical way, or you can also pair stories. Often I'll have a story where bear is mean and then one where bear is friendly. And so I give them those 2 examples. Here are 2 folktale versions of stories of wolves acting different ways. And so they'll see, because we often think that stories reinforce how things are in the world. And they don't really reinforce how things are, they reinforce how we think things are. And so I want to give people some other images of animals that do that. And diverse stories can do that, or flipping around a story a little bit, that try flipping the roles of the 2 animals. If it's an Aesop's fable, play around with it and flip the 2 animal characters so that the one that was not the hero before becomes the hero, and see how that happens. Sometimes you'll undo stereotypes that way. Or sometimes it might just happen accidentally. I didn't think real hard when Ben mentioned that the turtle is slow in speech but not dumb. I hadn't really thought that hard about it, that piece of it, but sometimes that just sort of comes out, that being the hero, smaller, slower creatures have to use their brains, and because they don't have any way around it. And biologically, that happens too. That animals have tools to help them solve problems. Sometimes the tools are instincts or brain tools. Sometimes they're physical tools. And in stories, animals like wolves or lions will use their physical tools to solve a problem. The animals like sheep or mice have to use their brains to escape. And then there's probably some biology for that too. The smarter animals tend to survive. The ones that aren't quite as quick or clever end up being dinner, and that's how things work. So finding ways to make the animals more interesting, having them not act like they're stereotype, or excuse me, or finding ways to tell different kinds of stories can be really interesting rather than having just two-dimensional characters. Another challenge with animal stories is it's a real problem, especially for animal-wise stories, if folks haven't seen the animal. This was not a problem 100, 200, 300 years ago because we tended to see animals that lived in our neighborhood, which would be the animals we'd tell stories about. 300 years ago, nobody told a story about elephants if you lived in North America. Well, 300 years ago, a whole different group of people lived in North America. But, you'd never tell stories about other places. It was always local. These animals right here. So we have this problem now, is that you go into schools and kids haven't seen beavers before. Telling a story about how beaver got a flat tail doesn't work if kids have no idea what a beaver looks like. And so I bring in props. I'll bring in animal pelts and skulls. I'll bring in big pictures, either slides on a slide projector or a digital projector, or a big poster of an animal. Because animal-wise stories don't work if people don't know what animals look like today. Because the assumption is animals look different in the past, and now they've changed to this story to look this way. And then once you get to the, why beaver has a flat tail, it's real easy then to step off into that, talking about how beavers use their tails, because they've got all kinds of great adaptations with beaver tails. But you can't even start that unless people know what beavers look like today. So having props can be really helpful when talking about animals. You have to make sure that your audience knows the animal you're talking about. If it's at the zoo, of course, Bethany has an advantage. The animals are right there. You can talk about the animals, right in this place. But if you don't have that advantage and you're telling a story about another country, it helps to have pictures of some sort there just to get people in context. And people generally know what an elephant looks like, generally know what a giraffe looks like, but there's certainly nothing wrong with having those pictures along. Because a lot of the why stories really depend on those pieces. Stories that explain how rhinoceros and giraffe got their coats, don't work so well unless you know how wrinkly rhinoceros's skin looks right now. The pitfall number 3, teller doesn't know much about the biology of story animals. That's where the big chart here comes in. And I assume unless you have a background in biology and ecology and have an interest in this, you're not going to have tons of information. So use your resources. There are naturalists at the conference. There are probably naturalists or people that do biology things in your neighborhood. Pick their brain. Just like I picked the brain, we have a neighbor across the street who grew up in Moscow, Russia. And whenever I'm doing a Russian story, I run all the names past her, like, how do you pronounce this, and how do you pronounce that? Because she has that cultural background and knows how it works. You can treat naturalists and scientists the same way. I'm doing a story about bear, and he does this in the story. Does that make sense? Or I'm trying to act like a bear, how would you act a bear out if you were going to do it? And those folks can be great resources. Charts like this work, books work. The Tales with Tales book has some great examples about animal information. Another piece is, number 4, the teller doesn't know much about the mythology of story animals, the stereotypes and archetypes of those animals, what they represented. And the symbolism piece is in one of these columns right here too. Symbols sometimes matter. And usually I'm trying to work against the symbols that I run into about wolves being mean or snakes being evil. Just because so many of those animals, the folklore that we get translates really directly into how we treat the animals. And so if you look at animals that are disappearing or not being cared for very well, they tend to be the ones that don't have folklore advocates. And so trying to work against those pieces, showing the value of those animals. And part of it came back to my working environmental light ecological message. All the parts work. Aldo Leopold said that the most important part of intelligent tinkering is to save all the parts. You need all those pieces to work together for things to work. And we often lose sight of that. But showing people, even though this animal is a predator, even though mosquitoes bite you, even though snakes make us a little bit nervous, even though in Minnesota we have garter snakes and one venomous snake. But anyway, all these animals have jobs. And when you pull one out, there's a problem. And we see that in Yellowstone now with the wolves. We pulled wolves out, and now suddenly you see when they come back how different the land is. And so looking at some of the symbolism we have for animals or the mythology of animals, and then usually trying to turn it on its head, because those cultural attitudes about the animals usually are dated. You know, they're dated in the same way that folkloric ideas about women are pretty dated. We wouldn't tell a lot of fairy tales the way they were written 100 years ago, because back then, you know, women had certain roles and men got to do a lot of other stuff. And then children, you know, were told, you know, we're not going to let you just hear these stories, but we're going to tell you what it means by giving you that moral at the end of the story, because you kids aren't very smart. And, you know, those sorts of ideas we've moved away from now. And it's okay to update animal stereotypes the way we've updated human stereotypes, and even cultural stereotypes. You know, there were time periods in which certain countries thought they were more valuable than other countries, and shared that in their folklore. You know, you'll see it in some of those pieces. And when I see those sorts of outdated information, whether it's a cultural stereotype or a gender stereotype or an animal stereotype, I usually look for ways to break that and change it. And usually flipping it around as much as you can. That's the quickest way to do those pieces. And that leads you to the, you know, what happens if you can't find the stories that you want. Let's see, we went through all the pitfalls yet? Oh, we haven't. I looked at the last pitfall. This is my number 1. Number 5, teller chooses a story that he or she doesn't like because it deals with a particular animal. When I first started doing storytelling as a naturalist, I wanted to be doing stories in lots of programs. And so I had a deer program coming up. And I thought, okay, I need a deer story. I go to the library, flip through all the books, look for a story that has the word deer in it. And I thought, oh, perfect, there's a deer story. I read it real fast, go out and try it out in the program. And I realized it didn't work because I didn't like the story. It was just one that happened to have a deer in it. I felt I needed a deer story for my deer class, and so I'll use that. And you've probably had this experience too. If there's a story you feel you have to do but you don't like, it's really hard to make it work. And so ideally, you know, plan further ahead than I did and look for stories that you really like that involve those animals. Or in some cases, you know, if you can't find a deer story, sometimes I'll look at other countries. You know, what are other countries similar equivalent to the deer we have in the US and in Minnesota? And so in some cases in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia, there are water buffalo stories. And there's some connections ecologically and even physically. The feet of a water buffalo and the feet of a deer are really similar. There's a great story about how water buffalo split its hoof. And the split hoof is the same thing you see on deer in the US. And so that story translates really, really well because you have a similar animal. And so you can often, you know, look for other stories and then do what storytellers have always done, pick it up and move it to this country and set it, as long as the pieces all work together. It wouldn't work to take, I'm trying to think of an example. You know, if it was a story that had to involve a horse, and you try to take that water buffalo story, it wouldn't work here because the feet are different. So finding other countries' stories and remaking them the way we've always done is it something to do to find that story that works, or make up your own stories. And the make up your own story part is a whole different kind of workshop. But just really quickly, one thing you could do is kind of work backwards. When I was working on, I wanted a story about how a snake lost its legs. Because every cultural story you find about snake losing its legs, either it did something evil, or it was cursed, or something horrible happened, and that's why it lost its legs. It's a bad animal, we should all stomp on them and kill them. That was the message. And I thought, okay, how do I do something different? And I worked backwards. I thought, okay, it's a snake story. I want ecological relationships. What's another animal that has an ecological relationship with a snake? And ecological relationships are generally predator-prey relationships. That's generally where we are at. So, okay, who eats snakes? What do snakes eat? And that took me really quickly to frogs. Frogs are eaten by snakes, and so there's a predator-prey relationship. And so that was pretty handy. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute. I want a story where snake has legs and loses them. And I realized, oh, frogs, they don't have legs and they get them. And suddenly I had this great parallel. And so I could create a story where snake had legs and then got tricked into losing them by tadpole, who then stole the legs and hopped off and became frog. And that's why snakes hate tadpoles and frogs, because they stole their legs a long time ago, and that's why they bite them and eat them. And so I had all the pieces put together.
The frog the bad.
It is. Frogs don't have to be villains very often, and so, sorry, Mr. Frog.
You're a species.
I did, but the frogs had the legs, which was a good thing in the end, so, yeah. I keep forgetting the frog thing, anyway. So, So yeah, there are ways to do that too, and the I talked a little bit earlier about how ecology and ecological relationships and those things are kind of the background mythology of creating new nature stories, and the understanding nature and creating stories out of it isn't new. We did that hundreds of thousands of years ago, but nowadays by starting with the basis of your animal stories being ecological relationships, then it's really easy to take that step from the story to the science because they're already embedded and connected. And so then it's really easy to talk with kids about the predator-prey relationships, and we talked about in the story, the story gave this example of why snakes eat frogs. Anybody know a science reason why snakes eat frogs? Well, they're nearby, they're easy to catch, they don't have many defenses, those sorts of things. So, any questions? We're wrapping up just about the time. Yes?
We kind of touched on the pronouns. He, she. How do you feel about it, or they, or their?
Yeah, I don't love those because it makes the animal non-personal and more of an object than a character or person. And so I generally try to do she as much as possible.
God is always the main.
So
But God is the main.
yeah, I mean you can try it out if it works for you. There's nothing, there's no rule that says you can't do that.
Yeah.
But I try to use the he and she terms because I think it makes a little closer connection between people and animals, and that's something we don't see a lot. And I think I breezed over it here. It's the top of page 2. It talks about make a connection between the animals in the story and the audience. If people don't have a connection to the animal by the end of your story, look for a way to make that connection as much as you can. Whether it's, you've seen frogs in your neighborhood, or you've seen snakes in your neighborhood, or next time you see an eagle fly over. Because when I'm doing storytelling, one of my goals is that when people have heard that story, that'll spark something in their brain next time they see that animal. And the more you can make those connections, the better. And sometimes it's the connection because it explains something about the animal. Sometimes it's a connection because it's an animal they see every day, and so it answers the question. And then also if you go from the story part to giving a little bit of science, then you might be a science fact like the one that, bats don't really try to fly into your hair. They fly around you because there are mosquitoes right here above your head, which is why bats dive bomb you, is because you are a host for mosquitoes. But we get really nervous because we think they're swooping down trying to grab us. But giving them that little bit of information that's useful to them that they're going to take home that helps them coexist with animals. And so that's often something that I do, and if that fits with what you're doing, that works well too. But the more you can give these pieces, sounds and movement and reasons with animals, the better the characters, the more interesting the characters generally are and become for us. And part of that is just doing the research and finding out about the animals. And a lot of this can be, in your own neighborhood. We're talking about watching squirrels in your backyard. And go to a zoo and watch the animals there. Go to Bethany Zoo in Madison. Maybe there will have to be a field trip at some point. Sit and watch the animals for a while. It's a little weird because zoo animals aren't wild animals. It's not exactly the same thing, but it gives you the basics.